Rocks can turn up in all sorts of places, so how do we draw rocks that can clearly be seen as being rocks? How can we have rocks that at a glance sit happily in the landscape? Here's my secret for drawing rocks that look like rocks every time. The secret to drawing anything is to observe our reference and to understand the form that we're trying to draw, the shape that it is, and then work out the best way to represent that with whatever shadows, textures, and edges may be presented. And form, except in spherical shapes, is defined by planes. And if when we look at a rock, we can see it in a simplified form defined by its planes, it makes it much easier for us to work out what we're going to do with it. Let's look at this rock here. It's a bit like seeing it as a roughly cut jewel. It's simplifying the shape into areas that make it easier for us to see how it might be best represented with things such as shadow and edges. But rocks don't have sharp edges the way we'd get in a polished diamond. And so we want to allow for some of the softness of edges. And for that, when I draw my rocks, I like to save the sharpest edges in terms of straight lines for edges that really are quite sharp, and softer, more broken edges, or sometimes a thicker and a thinner line for edges that are curving away from me and don't represent a sharp edge at all. And because rocks are usually outside and they're usually catching the sunlight, then part of the secret to revealing them, making them look real, is the way they are shaded by the position of the light and the shadows they cast. And this is where thinking in terms of planes is really helpful. Even if we've drawn some of these edges less precisely, they help me position my hatching. Rocks also can have a surface texture. And in this case, this Sydney sandstone is made up of lots of layers that don't always weather at the same speed. So we do get a lot of banding, a lot of horizontal shapes and textures, reflecting the layers of silt of sand which were laid down. So let's draw all the rocks on the downward side of this pathway that leads into Sydney Harbour and put these principles into practice, also remembering that we want our closer rocks to look closer than our further rocks. So we want a little more detail, a little more moulding, a little more variation in our lines with these rocks that are closer. Let's go. The first temptation I think that we find drawing a scene of rocks such as this is that we just decide to do them from our imagination and not observe carefully and draw carefully. And unless we're experienced in drawing rocks, that's probably going to be a large mistake, because we'll end up with a lot of rocks that look the same and don't look like any rock in particular, because we haven't probably observed rocks carefully enough to be able to do that accurately. And also, rocks look very different according to what they're made from, how long they've been in the open for, what their weathering has been exposed to, whether it's just wind or whether it's waves as well, whether we're looking at sandstone or granite or basalt. And not just are the edges weathered in certain ways, but the stones themselves can split and break open in certain ways. And so all of these things are characteristic of particular rocks. So when we've got rocks to draw, it's good to actually observe the characteristics of our rocks. Now, these ones have a lot of rounded edges because we can tell by the marine growth on them that they are covered at high tide. So they are being weathered by water as well as by wind. You can see that sometimes I do the edge, particularly the outer edge, but that often I define the edges by simply where the hatching stops. And this is, I think, a fairly effective way to do it, because the hatching doesn't stop exactly in the same place in a straight line every time. And so that does give a sense of the jagged edge that we have here. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that the scale of these rocks is fairly small. This isn't a detailed study of one rock, but it's a whole bunch of rocks gathered up together. And so we are limited by exactly how we can express any one rock. So we are also going for overall effect, and value is going to be very important in this. We want the darkest areas to look very dark, and we want the lightest areas to look very light. So we want to preserve white paper on some parts of the rock surfaces to demonstrate the full sunlight on them, and we also want some very dark parts to represent the shadow, which is the darkest part of this. Now, shadow is darker than shade, so the shadows that these rocks cast on the sand is actually darker than the shade of the parts of the rocks that are shielded from the sun simply because of the direction of the sunlight and their own shape. Now, I'm putting the shade that's on the side of this pathway in, and I do it a few times to make it fairly dark because it is a wonderful contrast line, I think. It's the only straight or straightish line we have. And it also, through negative space, defines the top edge of the rocks along the very top. And because they are in sunlight, it means we can really see that sunlight really clearly. So it's a great opportunity to add some visual drama to our drawing. I'm just trying to align with my reference to make sure I take these rocks across. Now, of course, in real life, we don't need to do them all as exactly as I'm trying to do them now. But I do want to capture them characteristic to how they really are, this particular rock. The other thing with these rocks that I was trying to capture is the fact that they are on sand that's sloping down towards the water. And so I have this downward slope line from left to right that I want to capture in my rocks, as well as the rocks that are coming towards us as well, which have another angle to them. Now, I'm doing most of my hatch lines vertically. Because this is a fairly busy scene, I do want to simplify it in a way, and I think it helps keep it look neater, and the hatch lines don't compete so much with the actual lines of the rocks themselves. But of course, hatching is absolutely a personal preference of the artist, so please experiment with whatever ways, whatever angles you would like to put your hatch in and your cross hatching lines over the top of those as well. But I generally want to try and keep this sort of scene looking a bit tidy, or else everything ends up getting tangled when there's so much line work so close together. Another thing to try and resist have happening is when we first position our rocks to not get the angles, when they're angled against each other, to not get the angles quite steep enough. It is easy, if we're not paying attention, to draw an angled rock a little bit flatter, a little bit more horizontal than it is. And I discovered this on a number of times. And yet it's these rocks that angle up away from other rocks that, again, creates a sense of visual tension, a sense of visual drama. So we don't want to lose that. We don't want all these rocks to look as though they've all been almost laid down as pavers. We want them to have a helter-skelter effect. And need to be a little more careful as the rocks come out on the right-hand side. I'm just aware of the water and how they look, and the ones that now start to have small barnacles or limpets or periwinkles. I'm not sure what they're called. But these also affect the silhouette edge. And so they do create a very dotted, fine sawtooth effect on the edges of some of the rocks. So if I just draw a straight line, I don't get the chance to have that, represent that in my drawing as well. So I need to be aware of that, have seen that detail before I draw the outline. And that's why we always have to observe carefully first, because drawing directly in pen, it's a wonderful freedom, but every line that we draw is going to be there at the end of the drawing. So we don't want to put lines in that we don't really want to have a bit later. So I've decided to finish these upper rows of rocks, and then to do the ones that sit on the sand. The ones that are a bit closer to us have to be a little more aware of the angles that they present on their left side edge, because that is going to create the sense of slope of the sand and also of the line of them coming towards us. They're also flatter too, so there's not quite as much scope to create dramatic planes with the hatching. So need to be a little more restrained with our lines, or else we'll overwhelm the width by creating too much height if we take our hatching lines up too far. So again, it's really important in this scene to get the shadows cast for every rock, because the shadow gives a lovely black, if you like, underlining almost effect to each rock. And so we don't want to miss any of those shadows. They're blackest, the darkest parts of this drawing. So now we're getting closer with these closer rocks that have the little shellfish stuck to them. And also trying to give a sense of there's some water just in between some of these ones on the extreme left where the ground level is lower. And again, there's some little shellfish on the rocks. There's also, though, on the relatively flatter rocks, though, there are still some evidences of the layers of the sandstone reflecting the original formation and the uneven weathering where some of the softer layers erode faster than the harder ones. I'm just checking up here for shadows, and I found a few that I hadn't done, so putting those in. And then I had an overall look at the whole scene and thought, where are the shadows darkest for these rocks? And just make sure that I actually make them darker. I don't want all the hatching to create uniform, even shadows or shading. I want some areas to be darker than others. And it's the sort of refinement I think is well done at the end, when we can have a better sense of the overall appearance and make those sorts of visual adjustments. Now I'm just drawing lots of barnacles, it seemed like at this point. And then it's, again, just thinking, is there anything I want to do? This is where it's easy to do too many lines, make too much detail with all these dots on the sand. But this is pretty much it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. It's really helpful, I think, to have a good technique for drawing rocks, because they do appear everywhere. And so I hope this has given something of a framework for that. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. But next time you go to the beach, why not take your sketchbook? Bye.